Living people are killed for their organs. Executions were shifted from the courtroom to the operation room.
16 years ago, the first whistleblowers emerged from China with a story that few could believe. The Chinese regime was killing prisoners of conscience for their organs.
Organ harvesting turned the previous persecution form of torturing to death into a profitable business.
Today I sit down with Dr. Torstenem Treyem, co-founder and executive director of the nonprofit Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, which just released a special report on the issue.
If the Chinese government is willing to kill people on an industrial level, you think of what mindset is that? We didn't react to it in time, probably because we thought China is so far away, and a few years later you are hit by a pandemic that is spread from China.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Dr. Torstenem Treyem, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, Dr. Treyem, this has been a long time coming. I remember back in 2006 when I first realized that this murder for organs industry in China was real and I started reporting on it. There was a small nonprofit that began in the same year called Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. And you were one of the co-founders, and we've interacted in various ways over the years. Before we go any further, just lay it out for me. What is this, what you call forced organ harvesting?
Yeah, forced organ harvesting is a practice that actually in 2006 nobody actually would think it could happen. We created this name. It was our NGO that came up with this term. It is the forceful extraction of organs used for transplantation. The typical way of giving a consent before you donate an organ, that has been bypassed. People are actually killed. Living people are killed for their organs. And I think it's fair to say that it only happens in China, because in a large scale it can only occur when the state is kind of promoting this crime. And it has reached industrial level. This is arguably the biggest violation of medical ethics in history.
And unbelievable when you frame it that way. Well, let's go back a little bit. Why don't you just tell me where this came from, where this idea to start this nonprofit came from, why it was needed, and why in 2006?
Yeah, in 2006, I learned from a newspaper, the Epoch Times, that witnesses from China came forward. They witnessed how in a hospital in Suzhou, organs or tissues were harvested from Falun Gong practitioners. That was so outrageous that it caught my attention. And just in that month, March of 2006, there were actually 3 people coming forward. A reporter, the wife of a surgeon who took corneas from Falun Gong practitioners, and an anonymous military doctor, veteran military doctor, who added even more details. It was beyond my imagination. I could hardly believe it. And I followed this case. And then 2 months later, I saw that the vice president of the European Parliament, Edward Macmillan-Scott, he followed that case too. He went to China. He met with 2 Falun Gong practitioners who told him that they saw a friend who died in detention who had holes in the body. And that was another piece of evidence that came together. 2 months later, I heard about the report from David Kilgore and David Meadows, who conducted phone interviews with hospitals in China. And they indeed recorded that doctors in the Chinese hospitals said they take organs from Falun Gong practitioners because those are fresh organs. So at that time, this was very shocking. And I decided to go in July 2006 to attend the World Transplant Congress in Boston. And I was thinking maybe I find some more hints. So there were, of course, doctors also from China. And I talked to 2 of them. One of them, he was from from the Tianjin hospital. He said last year they performed 2,000 liver transplantations. And that was an astronomical number. So I asked other doctors from other countries. In Argentina, they performed 200 liver transplants per year. In Germany, there were, I believe it was 700 transplants per year. And here we are in just from one hospital in Tianjin, they performed 2,000 liver transplants. So that was adding another factor to the scope of transplantations that took place in China. And at last, I talked to a doctor who was invited back to China to open a transplant department. But at that time, he was actually just working in a university in Germany, and he only conducted transplants on animals. So I was wondering how come that he was invited back to China to open a transplant department. And he said there was just this demand to open transplant departments. And I said, where do all those organs come from? Because transplantation depends on organs from donors. And he said those organs are coming from Falun Gong practitioners. So at that point, and that took all place within half a year, all these aspects, hints and pieces of evidence. And what was really striking was none of these witnesses were Falun Gong practitioners. And they were all hinting that organs were harvested from Falun Gong practitioners. So if you want some objectivity, here you have it. So at that point, I decided there must be more investigation and awareness. And I decided, well, just my voice is not big enough. If I want really attention, I would need to start an NGO. And that's how the idea of founding Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting came about.
You know, it might be amazing to people that are listening that a doctor from China admitted to you that these organs were coming from Falun Gong practitioners. Now, the context of this is that, you know, this was a group that had been demonized and targeted for eradication. In the words of Jiang Zemin, who had been the dictator at the time and issued the order. So it's possible for someone to say something like that with a straight face, or just imagine, not realize that how utterly barbaric it might sound. I mean, how did you react to that?
Definitely, it's barbaric. It is unfathomable. And I would think that because of this practice being beyond our imagination, that was the best way to hide the practice. When I was discussing this topic with other doctors at medical conferences, they were listening, and they were also seeing what data we produce and show. But at the end, they still said they can hardly believe this is happening, because it is beyond what we in the West would think is possible. It's just beyond our thinking.
So why don't you give me a broad picture of the kind of lines of evidence that exist? And this has developed substantially since 2006. That document the reality of this.
This question of evidence, you know, what evidence you have, this question comes up very often. If you want to get a short summary of this, there's evidence related to the transplant numbers, evidence related to the organ source, where the organs come from, how they are donated, and then witnesses coming forth. So over the time, we followed the numbers of transplants, and the transplant numbers in China are just out of proportion. If you follow the course of annual transplant numbers and compared with other countries, then you see in China this is almost like a roller coaster. It goes up, it goes down, it stays on a level for 10 years, it goes up again. You do not find this type of development in other countries that are based on ethical organ donation. In other countries, you find like a steady, gradual increase of organ donors, and then also transplants. But in China, this seems to be decoupled. Just recently in 2020, you see this example that a doctor team wanted to perform a double lung transplant on a COVID patient. And then just within 1 day, they said they got the matching lung and performed the transplant. This is unthinkable in a Western transplant environment. So it seems like organs are coming from on demand to facilitate transplant on demand. So the wait time in China is usually just considered between 2 days and 14 days. It's very typical. There was a camera team from Korea, southern Korea, that went with a hidden camera to one of these hospitals, and they filmed a nurse who was accommodating patients from Korea. And the nurse was saying, yeah, usually it takes 2 weeks to get a kidney, but if you pay $10,000 extra, you can get it within 2 days. And this is unheard of, that just because of an extra money you pay for an extra fee, you can accelerate the wait time and accelerate it to 2 days. So nothing in terms of transplantation numbers is kind of reflecting anything that you see in all other countries in the world. So this is one part, the transplant numbers, the wait times, but then also the donor numbers. We monitored a website where the numbers of organ donations were displayed, and we monitored this for 18 months, over 18 months. What we saw is that there was a gradual, very slow increase of registered organ donors, and then all of a sudden, at the end of 2015, within 1 day, it increased by 25,000, exactly 25,000, which is unheard of. It seems to me to be like an artificial number where it said, oh, we just add exactly 25,000, ending with 3 zeros. Yeah, these are registered organ donors are real persons. So just the fact that all of a sudden there are exactly 1,000 registered donors is unheard of. And we saw this again in the following year when 88,000 people were added to the so-called registered organ donor pool. So all of this you don't find in other countries. With other research, you saw that that these numbers are more manufactured. There were no real organ donors, but the numbers were following a mathematical equation.
Yeah, quadratic equation. I remember reading that paper, like a perfect quadratic equation.
Yeah. So, and then with this discrepancy between these large transplant numbers and the lack of organ donors, then the question is, where do those organs come from? And this is where the witnesses. So I talked with Falun Gong practitioners who said they were detained for 2 years and they were blood tested for 10 times. David Matters interviewed a prisoner who was not a Falun Gong practitioner. He said he was not blood tested, but he saw that Falun Gong practitioners are blood tested. So if you hear one witness talking, one Falun Gong practitioner saying he was subject to forced medical exams while in detention, while being subject to torture, which itself is already implausible. If there's one Falun Gong practitioner saying he was medically examined, you can say it's an anecdote. But if there are hundreds and thousands of Falun Gong practitioners over 20 years who keep repeating this and similar experiences, who said that I was threatened, the policeman said, if I don't follow this, they will take my organs. If you hear this many witness reports, then the anecdote is not an anecdote anymore, it becomes an evidence. So if you take all of this together, then you have an overwhelming set of circumstantial evidence You know, each piece itself might not be that strong, but if you put everything together, then you can say there's enough evidence to say something is wrong here.
So, obviously the Chinese communist regime has been, accused multiple times of these practices. How have they responded?
Well, in one case with Xu Zhetun, they didn't respond at all when the claim was made. They were silent for 5 weeks, and then all of a sudden they say, "Oh, now a delegation is being invited," and of course, the delegation after 5 weeks did not find anything. Yeah, so this is typical. If you have scheduled inspections, for sure you will not find anything. What China is not doing is it is not allowing unscheduled investigation or inspections. It is basically denying that this is happening. If you want, you can compare it with the 1989 student massacre on Tiananmen Square. The Chinese government says it didn't happen, although there's footage, but it didn't happen. And same with the forced organ harvesting from Falun Gong prisoners of conscience is also denied that this is not happening.
Why is it the Falun Gong that were particularly targeted or are?
Well, for once, it is a large group that is detained, so you have all of a sudden access to a very large pool of organ donors. Not organ donors, but sources, organ sources. That's one aspect, but you can also argue that other groups, other prisoners of conscience could also be targeted. So those are not typically targeted. It is mainly Falun Gong, and if you want to look into the reason, then you have to look into 1999 when a persecution of Falun Gong started, and the Chinese government overnight basically declared Falun Gong as a state enemy. But it was not the fault of Falun Gong because nothing has changed in their practice, but it was just the aspect of, for example, being truthful, which imposed a threat, a perceived threat to the Chinese government. So at that point, the former head of state, Jiang Zemin, he just single-handedly said this group is now banned and basically has no rights. Now, the experience with the student massacre showed the Chinese government that it cannot just crack down on a group with high intensity, because then the international community will respond to it. So they had to come up with a different approach. So they wanted to destroy this group, Falun Gong, but in a way that it is not raising international attention. So over time, basically the executions were shifted from the courtroom to the operation room. Organ harvesting turned the previous persecution form of torturing to death into a profitable business. The organs from Falun Gong practitioners could be sold for transplants. So there was a financial aspect that was used by the Chinese government. They want to eradicate this group. They want to destroy it. And what better way could there be than using Falun Gong practitioners as organ source?
You know, I was talking with Ethan Gutman perhaps half a year ago. He's one of the researchers who did a lot of really valuable work in basically developing the set of evidence and so forth. In past years, as the Chinese regime ramped up basically the genocide of the Uyghur people, he's saying that this has become a significant group in recent years. It struck me as something where, like, if you don't deal with something over years, it doesn't stop. It just will get transferred to another group that's targeted for eradication.
Yeah, this is a very typical phenomenon. If you violate ethical standards and you get away with it, then you get the appetite to go to the next level, to go to the next profitable area. For example, for the Uyghur group, because Muslims, they don't eat certain food. So you find people from the Middle East who are specifically looking for Muslim organ donors to get the type of organs that they prefer. China followed this market to open the Uyghur people to serve this group of transplant tourists who are looking for specific organs. But we cannot forget that this is a relative speaking smaller group, whereas the Falun Gong practitioners estimated to have 70 to 100 million people in 1999. So it's a extremely large group, and because it is persecuted in the whole country, you have a pool of organ donors that can still serve the transplant hospitals in the different regions. So we cannot shift our attention to just one group while the other group that has been subject to forced organ harvesting for 20 years is being kind of sidelined. This is a very dangerous move.
Do you feel that's happening somehow?
You find in certain organizations, for example, the World Medical Association came up with a statement, a resolution, where it acknowledges the genocide of Uyghur people. However, so far, Falun Gong, who is subject to this destruction over 20 years, has not been recognized as a victim to genocide. Yeah, I followed this very closely, and we think there's an imbalance.
One of the things I wrote about years ago was sort of the inability of people to just accept that human beings do such terrible things. You know, I was citing Jan Karski, who, you know, broke into concentration camps in Poland. He was a Polish nobleman, masqueraded as a Ukrainian guard, you know, saw what was happening, got out, went to England, went to the West, to the US, tried to tell people. People wouldn't listen. Even the Attorney General of the US said, I think famously, it's not that I thought he was lying, it was that I was unable to believe him. That was, I believe, the official line, or something close to that. So how much does this figure into, you know, the current state where essentially the Chinese Communist Party has been largely held unaccountable to this in almost any way, with a few exceptions? Yeah.
I believe that there are several factors that come into play. One is that the crime is just too unbelievable, it's beyond what we can fathom. But at the same time, it is probably also an effect of the effort of the Chinese government to cover it up. So you can imagine forced organ harvesting, the killing of people for their organs. This is a serious crime. It's probably the most outrageous violation of human rights that one can imagine. Not only you're killing people, but you are also using their organs to make a profit. So you can imagine that if this would surface, if this would be reported in the mainstream media, China would have a hard time to stop an international outcry. So, of course, China tries everything to stop this issue, to use bribery, to use other influence, to stop newspapers from reporting about this issue. Specifically on this topic of forced organ harvesting, we have an issue of self-censorship of Western media. And this, we need to look into this, because the crime is just too big to be censored.
It's striking to me that, for example, the Transplantation Society, which is the premier global organization focused on organ transplantation, has either not taken a position or, you know, essentially taken a position that mirrors that of the Chinese Communist Party in this. I mean, I guess the question is, one is, how much has that hurt your advocacy efforts? And two, what's going on with that?
Yeah, this is a discrepancy that I followed for some time. On the one side, the Transplantation Society says they are a professional society and they don't have the resources to investigate in China. On the other side, the Transplantation Society also makes statements that China is on the right way. So on one side, you say that you cannot investigate this topic, and on the other side, you produce statements that China is developing in the right way. There are several reports, investigations that are admittedly like hundreds of pages long, but I don't know if the Transplantation Society or the leadership in the Transplantation Society has really studied those reports and looked into it.
Well, for example, the China Tribunal, which comes to mind, I mean, one of, I think, of the most comprehensive body of evidence, right? I believe you testified there. Briefly tell me, what was that? What were the conclusions? And yes, why is the Transplantation Society unaware of the findings?